Okay, so our next question's asked, our next part is just looking at, well, why is it we need more housing? So why is it we're thinking about where to live? Why do we need to think about this? Well, one of the reasons is we have more people. Now, if people live longer and there are still people being born, this means you've got an increase in your population. Now, the problem that's going to cause as well, where are all these extra people going to live? So you need to start thinking about, well, where do we build? Are we going to build in the countryside? Are we going to build in the city? Another thing is there are more people living in certain areas. So we saw it with shanty towns, worldwide people are moving from the countryside, from rural areas into the city. So this changes numbers of people living in certain areas and it means we start seeing more housing. Now the reason is there are more single people. So a lot of the average age you get married at has increased about 10 years in the last 60. So when my gran got married, she was, 26, 27. That was quite old. Most people got married in their very early 20s. Nowadays, the average age of marriage is about 30, but many people get married a lot later than that. Another thing is more people divorce. In some places, nearly half of all marriages end in divorce. So that's one household will suddenly become two households. So we have more single people, more people in need of separate housing. Another thing is lack of affordable housing. This is where people need to build more cheap housing for key workers. Now, you might hear if you watch the English news a lot about key workers with the coronavirus. So, who are the most important workers in society? And most people agree that these are generally police, teachers, if I say so myself, nurses, and other people who do essential jobs, but maybe don't earn a great deal of money. If you're a doctor, you're probably fine, you're probably earning a very good salary. But nurses aren't, and nurses are just as important as doctors when it comes to keeping things like hospitals and healthcare running. So you need to start building more cheap houses because if we remember our assessment pattern, your police officers, your nurses, your teachers probably can't all afford to live in the high class residential area um, in the city. So you might need to think, and what if there isn't enough in the low and middle class? So you're going to have to think about, well, where can we build so that these people who we need to keep our city running can live in the city? Now it says here demand for housing can outweigh supply and more needs to be built. So that what that means is supply and demand is basic economics. Demand means people want it, so people want houses, and supply is the number of houses there are. So if there are more people wanting houses than there are houses built, you need to start building more. Now the problem here we're seeing is finding enough space to build new houses without spoiling the countryside, without spoiling your rural areas. Now in Britain in the 1940s, areas around cities were designated as green belts to try and conserve the countryside. So if you're conserving something, it means you're keeping it the way it is. So if you see the word conservation, it's often relates to the environment. It's about keeping the environment in a good condition in the way it is. So this was in the 1940s in Britain. The countryside was very nice, very made up a very big part of the country, and people didn't want to see it spoiled, didn't want to see it ruined with new buildings. Um, and they were worried about urban sprawl. Now, this is when the city grows out. Now, green belt areas, that's what we call them in the UK. Other places have different names. Most Western European countries will have some version of green belt housing, but they might call it something different. But these are rural areas that it's very difficult to build on because there are restricted building regulations. That means there are laws that stop people building in these areas unless they meet certain criteria. Now, if we look here, this is an example of urban sprawl. So you can see you've got the city in the background, but that city is starting to grow outwards, and that's what we call sprawl. So sprawl is when something starts to spread outwards, and we can see it's spreading outwards to the point that it's surrounding the pyramids of Giza. So the areas, while that area is conserved, the city is growing out around it. Okay. Now, the next part is what's a brownfield site and what's a greenfield site? Now, a brownfield site, you can see in the picture, is land that has already been built upon. So these areas become derelict or unused. Derelict is when something starts to basically fall down and is in bad condition and is no longer, it's not used anymore. So if you think of maybe areas of cities where you might feel unsafe walking because there's not lots of empty buildings, those buildings are in bad condition, they don't look stable. That is what you would call a derelict building. You might see it, one telltale sign of a building's derelict is maybe it doesn't have windows anymore. Maybe it has boards on the outside to try and stop people getting into it. That would be a derelict building, or just buildings that aren't used anymore. They might still be in good condition, but they aren't used. Now, governments generally encourage building houses in these sites. So you can see they're knocking down the old, bad condition, unused buildings and building something new. Now, a greenfield site is what you might consider to be the green belt, land that hasn't been built on before. It's unspoilt countryside. So that means countryside land that hasn't had anything built on before. And governments generally aim to protect these areas in more economically developed countries, because in more economically developed countries, lots of people value being able to go out to the countryside and they don't want to see these areas spoiled or ruined. Now, what you're going to do is in your book, there's another table. What are the advantages and disadvantages of developing new homes on greenfield sites compared to where brownfield sites, compared to using brownfield sites might there be? Now, you're going to have a table where you have to think about the good and bad points of both greenfield and brownfield sites. I want a good amount of detail in each box. I'm going to give you feedback next time, and if there isn't enough there, I'm going to ask you to spend some time improving that. So I'm looking for lots of different ideas, but some things you might want to think about, and you should come back to this video if you forget any, it can be replayed, are increase our urban sprawl, the impact it might have on congestion, depending on where you build, the impact on derelict land in the inner city. So why could it be good or bad to build in this derelict, derelict is a bit like damaged, poor condition land in the inner city? The impact on the drainage basin and flood cycle and flooding. So this is thinking back to last year, remember when you've got an urban area, you've got concrete on the ground, it makes it, unlike the countryside where rainwater will be absorbed into the soil, concrete stops that from happening. So it creates a risk of flooding because while water in the street will go into the sewers can only handle so much water. So what might be the impact depending on where you choose to build? The need for new roads and transport links. What impact might that have whether you pick a greenfield or brownfield site? The cost of demolishing, refurbishing, building new homes. The impact on the countryside.